we want to welcome you, a very warm welcome to you. This is the fourth webinar that we're doing. We have 11. We have 3 of them that are done. There is a link in the chat box that has recordings for the first 4, and we'll have a recording of the rest of them soon. Additionally, you can register for additional webinars that are upcoming at that link. And then finally, we'll have questions at the end. So with that, David has been doing community building for decades. He was the founder of Microboards and also cooperatives in Canada. He lives in Vancouver, Canada. He and I have been colleagues for years, and I'm just elated to have him come be with us. He's also a co-trainer with the entire series that we're doing with supervisors and service coordinators, and we'll be doing at the top of the year with families and people with disabilities around person-centered planning to be building on that. David is the founder of what's called Star Raft, which is a particular model of community building. David has currently a project from the Council on Developmental Disabilities in Illinois, where he's engaged in helping families create connections to associations and church groups and community groups. And David's just about to start a new project in the state of Michigan, again by the DD Council, to build community building. So we're really fortunate to have David with us here. David, you're on. Thank you for being with us.
Good, thanks, Mark. Years ago, we were doing some work with the Nisga'a people in the Nass Valley of British Columbia. One gentleman was coming home from 36 years in an institution that he'd gone into when he was a baby. And the people wanted to develop some plans for how to support him, but also to follow his idea of bringing what he described as all the wheelchair people back into the community. He said he wanted to build track. And as we visited with them and learned from them, we learned to start any important event by honoring our teachers. And this includes all of the people that you'll hear from over the course of this set of webinars: Beth Mount, Jack Pierpoint, Judith Snow, John O'Brien, and we're including some of the people that you'll hear from and learn about today. John McKnight is another major teacher. Joan Loomis is a mom in Winnipeg who created a lot of the work that we're doing. And Margaret Wheatley, who's a biologist who touched base with our field and said, it looks like what you're doing is developing tools for thinking together and creating together and staying together. And she said it's been her observation that people will truly support what they create, what they help to create. In his book, Arctic Dreams, the naturalist Barry Lopez writes about the Inuit people in the far north of Canada. He says there's a wisdom to be found in the people, and once in a great while an isumatak becomes apparent. And he says that word's often translated as meaning a wise person, but he says what it actually means is a person who can create the atmosphere in which the collective wisdom of a community has an opportunity to reveal itself. And in our experience, this collective wisdom includes the experience of energy and discovery and intimacy and creativity and commitment. And people are delighted when they see these qualities start to rise to the surface. And we've discovered along the way that the people who are at the center of this work, their families, their community partners, and their professional allies are in that role. They're actually our greatest teachers. Lopez also writes, the stories people tell have a way of taking care of them. If stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away when they are needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. That's why we put these stories in each other's memory. This is how people care for themselves. So today we're going to share a handful of stories that illustrate times when people discovered ways of building opportunity, connections, and commitments when they included community partners in what we think of as person-centered planning. The good thing is that we all start on common ground. Everybody knows that people thrive where they're known and loved, that committed relationships are the foundation of a good life, that on-purpose allies can generate opportunities for contribution because they can invite us into the places where they're making their contributions. That sharing the spaces, the social spaces, the work spaces, the learning spaces where we have standing opens the door to the presence and participation and contribution of people. And watchful allies can increase our safety and security. I live on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and about 200 yards off the coast where we are living, there's a rock wall that goes down about 200 feet. One of the ironclad rules of diving in this context is that you never dive alone. It's not allowed to dive alone, because if you get in trouble, there's nobody to help you get out. So if we're thinking about bringing people into the picture, where on earth do we find these people? Because often we feel like we're kind of stranded on a promontory like this one. And for me, the answer to that question came from a mom named Joan Loomis in Winnipeg back in the early 1980s. Joan had been thinking about her son Tom's future, and she had hopes for him finding meaningful, fulfilling work filled with interest, companionship, contribution, and a sense of mastery. And she figured that the existing service system at that time wasn't likely to generate the kind of future that she was envisioning for Tom. So she started to think about the little church that she attended with her family. It's a small church in a working class neighborhood. And she remembered the nursery rhyme they used to say as kids. Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the door and see all the people. And when Joan was showing me this, she wiggled her fingers and she said, David, I realized that everybody goes someplace during the week. And I said, Joan, what are you talking about? She said, well, Joe builds houses, and Harry works at the tractor plant, and Mary volunteers at the art gallery, and Bill works at a printing plant, and they all know Tom and they all like him. So what I'm thinking about doing is inviting them into helping us think about this for a while. And that question was one of the most strategic questions I've ever run into. She thought about approaching Harry, who worked at the tractor plant, and saying, Harry, we don't know where this might lead, but we wonder if you and Gwen would come over to the house for coffee and just help us think about this for a while. And we've advised and suggested and used this question, or a form of this question, every time we invite friends and neighbors and co-workers and church partners and so on into a person-centered planning event. I'm going to start by telling a story of our friends Scott and Alan. Scott and Alan have both given me permission to not only share their picture, but to share their story. We helped Scott step out of an institution where he'd been living since he was a baby. He had just turned 21. People in the institution said he really should be living in the regular community. We worked for about 6 months with those folks and with Scott, and with the beginning of a circle of people to help Scott step out. And one of the things that we did was found him a place in a small cooperative housing arrangement in Winnipeg. He wanted to live in town close to the arts community. And Scott was also on our board of directors. We had a commitment, longstanding commitment, to include and really respect the presence of the people that we supported in our board of directors. Scott and Alan met for the first time as Alan was coming to his first board meeting. And on their way up the elevator, Scott looked at Alan and he said, well, Alan, what do you think of me so far? And in the break in the meeting, they were talking guy talk, which is, how are the Jets doing? And what do you want? What do you do for a living? Al says, I'm a corporate lawyer. He says, Scotty, what are you doing? Scott says, I'm putting together earphones for Air Canada in a sheltered workshop. Alan says, how do you like that job? Scotty says, I don't like it at all. He says, I don't have any thumbs, so managing the small parts are really hard for me and I can't see very well. Alan then asked the $64,000 question that's at the heart of every person-centered planning event. Scotty, what would you love to be doing? And Scott said, radio. I've always wanted to be in radio. Alan didn't know that people had said for years that Scott couldn't be in radio because he couldn't see and he didn't have thumbs and he couldn't cue the records and things like that. What he did know was he said to Scotty, I know a guy who owns a radio station, and I'll connect you up and see what happens. So the next month, Scotty comes to the meeting. He says, Alan, what about that job in radio? Alan realizes he dropped the ball, calls the fellow from my office at home at 7 o'clock at night. They tee up the introduction. And Scott has been working at this small FM radio station in the south end of Winnipeg for the better part of 30 years now. And he's surrounded by this group of men and women who also work at the radio station, who also love radio, who figured out ways of adapting equipment and trying out various jobs. It's not full-time work, but it's paid work. And it puts him in a circumstance where his gift, his unique contribution is really known and loved. A couple of years ago, Al called us. We'd moved to Vancouver Island and said, Scotty's in the hospital. He's doing okay, but he hasn't woken up yet. And when Scott did wake up, he said, Alan, I'm scared. And Al said, you don't need to be scared, Scotty. You're fine. They've got your levels all straightened around. And Scott said, no, I'm scared they're going to send me back to the institution because I failed community living. I didn't watch my diet. And Alan said something that I'll never forget. He said, Scotty, you're one of the 5 safest guys in Winnipeg. First of all, you can come and live at my house if you need to while things get straightened around. But you've got all the folks at the radio station, all the folks in the co-op, all the folks in the Irish band that you sing and play with on Friday nights in Osborne Village. You're one of the 5 safest guys in Winnipeg, and that was true. What that story taught us and taught me was to follow the thread of Scott's gift or his interest or his dream in the direction of connection and companionship and contribution, and find the sweet places in the community where that gift might find life. And the sweet place is really defined by places where we have standing and influence, not as service workers, but as citizens, to share the story, find people who live with a lot of connections like Al, but it turns out that's just about everybody. It's critical to share the dream. This is a story about a young man who we met in one of the north central states, where we were doing a demonstration of the path planning process in a large conference. And this young man decided that he would stand as the example. We were asking him what his dream was, what his hope was. He was about 16 years old, a couple of years from finishing school, and he couldn't figure it out. He couldn't say. And finally, Faye asked him, what would you love to see coming alive in your community? And his head came up and his hands went to his hips and he said, biofuels, organic gardening, earth-friendly agriculture. He'd been part of a 4-H organic farming enterprise for years. What happened next was really remarkable. There were 17 strangers in the room, but when he said that, every single person in the room discovered that they had a connection, they had a contribution that they could be making. An adaptive funding source, a way of recasting his individual education plan, an association on biofuels, a hands-on summer internship in that realm, an alternative fuels fair. In our neighborhood, there's a watershed conservation society where there are a lot of people who are really concerned about what happens with the toxins and other things flowing into the Englishman River. There's also a group called the Mid-Island Habitat Enhancement Society, and one of our neighbors is a very active member in this. So if somebody says they're interested in biofuels and earth-friendly agriculture, we know who to bring into the meeting, into the question, into the planning session, because Scott and Alan and Joan Loomis and other people taught us to do that. In that context, the man in Wisconsin shows up as one of us and not somebody with a disability. And he's committed to the issue at the heart of that group's work. So they start out with a sense of shared identity and purpose. And the disability is just something to adapt around. Any one of these people has the potential to become a friend or an ally, somebody who knows the story, feels called to action, and can be invited to join up. When we share that dream and offer our contribution, every person in every one of these places can lend their connections to anyone else. So every thread we follow leads here to this really rich environment of associations and skills and workplaces and family and friends and trustworthy connections. Joan was tapping into this environment when they were taking informal action as a family. Let's look at what happened when some people that we also did a major set of paths for were on purpose about including community partners when they organized a person-centered plan. I've got people's faces blurred here, but I have permission to tell the story. The gentleman at the center was somebody who had lived in an institution for a long time, experienced some abuse there, had sort of bounced from one group home to an adult care home to another. And when we asked him in the presence of all of these people what his dream was, he said, I want my own house and my own land so that if caregivers have to leave, I don't end up homeless. And he said, I want to go sailing and I want to be in love. I want to have marriage and I want to grow a garden. And then he invited the other people in the room to talk about what their hopes were for him and their understanding of what his gifts were and his contributions were. And this very elaborate picture developed. And one of the elements on this was in the sort of 11 o'clock position, where somebody suggested something and he said, no, I don't want that on my plan. I want to go forward. I don't want to go back. So the person at the center has the power to invite people and to welcome people's contributions, but also to say, yeah, I'd love to have that on my plan, or I don't want to have that on my plan. But here was the key. PATH, among the other planning methods, has a kind of unique element, which is standing in a positive possible future, maybe in a year or a couple of years, and then asking the question, if you folks are doing good work in this direction for a couple of years, what's happened? And he was the first person who got to answer that question. And he said, I bought the house. And we said, that's terrific. How did that happen? And he thought about it for a while and he said, he was signing, by the way, he's a signing person rather than a speaking person. He said, I can't remember. We asked the rest of the people in the room how that happened. And his foster sister said, we used money from a trust fund to support the down payment. The person from the mental health system said, I arranged for the cash that he has through gain in the mental health system to support the work of a strong circle, but also to pay his mortgage. Somebody else said, I'm good friends with the manager of the credit union, the loans manager at the credit union, and we all came and stood with him when he was applying for his mortgage. Somebody else said, I baked pie. Somebody else said, I helped to develop, to construct a staircase inside so that the people who support him can live in a separate part of the house and come down to the garden level where he lives and support him when he needs support, and so on. What was happening in that moment was that everybody in the room, one after another, were making commitments because they saw how they could play a role in this emerging picture in terms of how the house, but also support from hearing people who could sign and signing people who were deaf, in terms of people sharing space and work and finances, in terms of his moving in the direction of coaching floor hockey and driving a tractor. Everybody had a connection with the places where that could happen. PATH and the other person-centered planning systems also always get down to really small-grained brass tacks And Mark Friedman was reminding me the other day about Faye's idea of never let anybody out of the room without getting a first concrete action step from them, and to give people small jobs to do, to give people roles that they can play month to month and week to week, so that people feel valued and engaged and like they are really helping something make progress. One of the first times I was involved in making something like this happen was 20 years earlier than the story that I just told you. A gentleman who we helped come out of an institution who'd been in there for 25 years. He'd gone in when he was 6, came out when he was 21. And we worked with the people in the institution, including a really strong ally, a psych nurse, who had identified the musical talent that he had and nurtured that musical talent. He and the young man would go out on the road together and play at local community fairs and other places. So Ziggy Brazisakis, who was the psych nurse's name, was key to helping us find and select a person who would create a home with and for our friend. And so here's a picture of what evolved at the outset, because again, we were on purpose about including people from the larger community, not only in the person-centered planning process, but in the process of moving forward. And this was actually the basis for the very, very first microboard. So you see here, there's Clarence and Lillian and Ginger and Kay and Tim from the university and Ziggy from the institution and folks from the Fort Richmond Lutheran Church and Lillian's personal circle and her connections with the Swedish musical committee and so on, community and so on, all collaborating together. The reason for this picture in particular is that about a year and a half after he came home, they were in church and about to take communion. Lillian had a pager at the time because her daughter was about to have a baby, and she was the labor coach. The pager went off. It's 10:30 in the morning or 11 o'clock in the morning. She's looking around. Kay Lindquist gets out of the pew and walks up and says, "Clarence, Lillian's gonna have to go and have Janelle have her baby. You can come and stay with us for the rest of the afternoon, and you can come to our house and we'll have dinner together. And if Lillian is not back, you can sleep over to our house. Would that be all right with you?" And he said, "That would be fine, Kay Lindquist." He was now talking. He wasn't talking when he first came out. And what I think about is how much trust Kay had in Lillian and Clarence, and how much trust Clarence had in Lillian and Kay and Leon, for that to happen in a moment at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, when in a traditional service arrangement, that would have been very hard to put together in time for her to get to her daughter's birthing. John McKnight, one of our big teachers, said a great community is one that systematically identifies and mobilizes the gifts of every one of its members. And that was the key to what was happening here. Not only the gift of his presence, but the gift of his musical talent. When we were visiting the Niska people in the north, one of the things that these folks did when the gentleman that I was telling you about came home after 25 years in the institution, or 30 years in the institution, was that they held a ceremony that is held when a new baby's born. About 6 months after the new baby's born, they have a ceremony. People don't generally dress like this, but these are traditional regalia that remind people of where people have standing in house, clan, tribe, and caregiving circles called whelps. And the maternal uncle holds up the child and announces where this child has standing in these places, what his roles are going to be in the community. And there's a companion role that says, as soon as you see the light in a child's eyes about something going on, some type of work going on, some type of enterprise, make that connection. Create the connection with the people who are doing that kind of work. By the way, the gentleman, when he was having his individual service plan done, support plan done, he said, I want to build track back into this community so the people in wheelchairs can come back. And I want to have a cooperative smokehouse in my backyard. So when it's time to smoke salmon, people have to come into my backyard to get that done. And the whole community pitched in and made that happen. So some communities have really strong patterns for remembering how to do this. We just need to practice it one person after another till we learn it again. One way of describing that is to systematically follow the thread of someone's gift or their interest or their capacity or even their burning question in the direction of companionship and connection and contribution. And that almost always involves, or it can really be supported by inviting people from the broader community who share those identities, who share those ideas, who share those interests and commitments into the person-centered planning process. And it turns out that the places where our interests and memberships and contributions intersect are extraordinarily powerful connectors. Think about it. Where did you meet your best friend? Where were you when you met the person who became your best friend? Where did you meet the person you love? Or where did you meet an ally who changed the direction of your life? People almost always discover friendship and commitment in the course of doing something else together, something that can sort of serve as a conductor or a conduit long enough for a friendship or a relationship to grow at its own pace. This doesn't have to be church. It can start anywhere. If somebody wants to express themselves more effectively, it can start with Toastmasters. And when I look at this group, I think about Joan's idea of open the door and see all the people and think about where all these people are spending their time and have standing and influence when they're not at the Toastmasters meeting. Habitat builders, if somebody wants to make a meaningful contribution. A drumming group, if somebody loves to make music. Conversation cafes, because there's a tradition of welcoming new voices. Family and extended family, because all these people go someplace during the day. And that leads to a story about what was taught to me. And I'm it takes me a long time to get the picture sometimes, by a direct support worker whose name was Joanne. Nick was somebody who we also helped get out of the institution. We had instructed her to find the places in the community where his interests were reflected in terms of finding work or finding a volunteer gig. And that when you were between gigs, when Nick was between gigs, to just keep looking, not to go into a sheltered situation. So one day, Nick and Joanne are at home. He's watching television. She's doing the dishes, but you can see him out of the corner of his eye. And he starts tapping really hard on his bliss board. And she runs up to him and says, Nick, what's going on? She was worried he was having a seizure, but no, he pointed to the television set. And he was watching a program about something called Winnipeg Harvest, which was a food bank of food banks, sort of a master food bank. And he typed on his bliss board, why are there people in Winnipeg who don't have enough to eat? Now, I didn't know enough about this pattern to have given a good answer to that, because I would have tried to answer Nick's question. Joanne was more intuitive than I was, and she said, why don't we go and meet Dave Northcott, who runs Winnipeg Harvest, and you can ask him that question. So they went, and this is not a picture of Nick, and Dave's in the lower left-hand corner. This isn't a picture of the people yet, because I don't have a picture of Nick and Joanne. But they made the appointment. They bumped up the stairs into Dave's office with Nick's wheelchairs. Joanne said, Nick has a question to ask you. And here's how you read the question. So she brought Northcott around his right-hand shoulder to look at him typing on his bliss board, why are there people in Winnipeg who don't have enough to eat? And that had been Northcott's burning issue, his burning question for the past 20 years. So Nick ended up at Winnipeg Harvest. This is what they built after they had to crank Nick up 12 wooden steps to get into the place. This is fully accessible now. And he's involved with companions and co-workers and co-volunteers at Harvest for quite, been for quite some time. Nick was also on our board of directors. And one day he came early to a board meeting because that's when the handy van was running. And we were watching a video documentary about the Holocaust. And the picture that we were seeing at the time was even more terrifying than this. And it was one that Nick saw. And it was, frankly, it was people being bulldozed into mass graves. And he said, what's going on? And we told him what was going on. And he typed on his bliss board, why? And again, I had not learned Joanne's lesson yet. And I gave him my answer, which was that the killings actually started with people with disabilities, and then expanded to include other people. And he thought about this for a while, and then he typed out very strongly on his bliss board, no, God, every person made, grandmothers, wheelchairs, everybody, which is really great theology. Having thought about this now, where might you go with Nick's question? Well, one possibility is the Jewish Community Center, because they might have not only some powerful answers to Nick's questions, but some opportunities for Nick to get involved and contribute to some of the things that they're working on, including what was in that era in Winnipeg, the early development of the Manitoba Human Rights Museum with an entire wing devoted to the Holocaust. My niece started me on this trail about 35 years ago when she was born. I went to say something and do training with her mom and dad when she was born. And I realized that I was only going to be able to say about two things. And one of those things was, as I thought about it, that the more she is surrounded by a circle of people who know her and love her and are willing to open doors for her, the better your life is going to be and the far better her life is going to be. She worked at Sears Roebuck for a long time. They kept her plugged in to neighborhood, school, preschool, community. I'm not sure exactly what the connection was to Sears Roebuck, but she was part of the set of people who dispatch fixers in California, Oregon, and Washington. And when Sears started to shut down, she created her own company called Grazie, which is Italian for the gift, for thank you. And she said, transform your relationships with powerful gifts, our gifts. And she became part of a group of women in Roseville, California, who are entrepreneurs. So she's in the middle, and these other women are there, and they're supporting each other in building their businesses, in building entrepreneurship. And this is a huge deal. So as she's standing there with the Roseville Chamber of Commerce and these other women, think again about who's in the room, where do they have connections, what are their interests beyond this realm of entrepreneurship. And if we make creative invitations, all of those things can come into play for her. It helps to be clear about what you're asking people to do. And the first thing is to remember Joan's modest request, come and help us think about this for a while, which is one way of describing a person-centered planning meeting. But we're also hoping that people over time will introduce us to people they already know, serve as a conductor to places where they already have standing, follow networks of trust, and make agreements on how we'll ensure major safeties in the work that we're doing together, share the dream. And again, this comes back to our Wisconsin story of everybody discovering that they have a contribution, mobilize the gifts and capacities of the person at the center, look for the sweet places in the community, which tend, by the way, to be small and intimate and based on cooperation rather than competition. Make an agreement to be tied in for a while. And the last story I'm going to tell you is about Tom Baker, who was our neighbor when I was 19 years old and changed the direction of my life. Tom had moved into the neighborhood at the same time we did. We all built retaining walls and planted trees and put in lawns together. When I was 19, I was out of work and sort of at odds and at loose ends. And Tom Baker created a little job for me in the printing plant where he worked. He was the estimator in the printing plant. And what I didn't know at the time was Tom was teaching me his job because he had a vision for his own life that involved moving to a small town in Washington and becoming a newspaper editor. If Tom had not done that, if Tom had not taken that first step, my whole life would have been different. We wouldn't be having this conversation, I guarantee you, because that job led to the next, led to the next, led to the next opportunity and the next experience and the next possibility, led me into this field. And I realized 30 years later that what Baker had done was he had created what we now call customized employment for this kid in the neighborhood. And we need to be able to do that for each other and for ourselves. So there's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to be sitting here someday, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So now is always a good time to start this process on your own behalf, on behalf of somebody you love or care for or plan for or serve as a service coordinator for, and to bring these people on board. And remember Joan's modest question, just come and help us think about this for a while. People will, their lights will turn on, and you'll find people making commitments and offering connections and opportunities in places that you never expected. So instead of thinking that we have to build circles or do something magic, start with one friend. Make an invitation now because it's the best time to plant a tree.